Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for the introduction and for chairing this session. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I want to talk about Minsky for today, somewhat pretentious title, but I hope to show you what I mean. Minsky's financial instability hypothesis says that financing structures supporting long-lived assets, so capital goods, tend to become fragile endogenously. So if financial markets are liberated, this happens of its own account, leading to financial instability. Either that financial instability can be prevented by policy intervention, or the financial instability will be followed by policy interventions by central banks. Okay, I'm not going to go into the detailed argumentation. I'm assuming that everybody understands what Minsky's financial instability hypothesis is, but I'm going to show it in more detail. One framework, I think, to usefully think about the financial instability hypothesis is to use the monetary circuit, where in step one in this picture, credits or other forms of finance are given by the financial sector to consumer good firms, which leads to investment in capital goods and which allows the consumer goods firm to pay wages while production takes place, followed by, if the finished products are sold, by sales revenues, which come to both capital goods and consumer goods firms. And these revenues will allow in step 5 for the debt to be repaid. Okay, so that is the financial circuit, that is the macroeconomy. So here income is generated. It's a positive sum process. The economy is developing. The debt is first growing with lending, and then it's decreasing again with repayment, but meanwhile more debt will have been issued. So debt is continually rising, but income is also continually rising, and the ratio can be stable. And therefore debt finance investment generates the income from which to repay. And that is hedge finance, it's safe finance. Now there is a possibility for these stable situations to destabilize itself. Actually not just a possibility, but a tendency, as Minsky emphasized. A few observations on this. Minsky emphasized long-lived assets, capital assets. What I ask in my Minsky for today application of his framework is, are we talking about real capital assets, machines and so on, or robots, or are we talking about financial assets? And I know that there are much stronger valuation and much stronger feedback loops between valuation of the assets and the increase in borrowing, leading to higher valuation of the assets, leading to higher borrowing, much stronger feedback loops in financial assets, including real estate assets, than there are in machines, robots, buildings, and so on. And therefore, there's a much faster deterioration, a worsening of the financial robustness of the economy and an increase of financial fragility, the more we are talking about financial assets, and including real estate assets. So the problem is not just in the financing structures, in the financial contracts to finance given assets, but it's in the choice of assets themselves, right? And the canonical example, the most widely relevant example, is property, real estate versus productive capital. Investment in property has different consequences than investment in productive capital, in long-lived assets, as Minsky called them. But we can also think of the financing of mergers and acquisitions, of the buyback of shares, and so on, and any borrowing financing that goes into financial assets. Different from pre-Keynesian and also mainstream or bastard Keynesian business cycle theory, Minsky's novel contribution was to problematize financing conditions, to ask questions about financing conditions that had not been asked before. And different from Minsky's two-price theory of investment, I will ask questions about the return generating capacity of investments. And so we need to distinguish between long-lived productive capital assets, which generate profit to repay the debt, and financial, including real estate assets that don't generate profit, but it generates capital gains. And the hypothesis that will follow from this is the financial stability hypothesis that Minsky formulated, but for our time, which I will call the debt shift hypothesis. The problem is here not only in changes in funding structures for given assets, but it's in changes in the choice of assets themselves. So it's this endogenous shift in the use of debt and other financing, which creates the instability. Okay, I'm going to skip this and to show you how the debt shift scenario is different from the financial instability scenario. In the financial instability hypothesis, financial deregulation leads to more borrowing, and that's the same in the debt shift scenario. The difference is when this borrowing leads to more capital goods investment, therefore more profit and validation of debt structures. For Minsky, for me, there is more investment in real estate and financial assets, and therefore negative effects on profit and wages, but positive effects on capital gains. So returns to asset owners rise and returns to borrowers will fall in the form of profit and wages. In both cases, you get more optimism and more borrowing in the boom with a shift to speculative or Ponzi financing. So the outcome is the same. It's still financial instability, but there are some other insights, I think, that you can get from the debt shift scenario, apart from the fact that it's more relevant to what the economy looks like today. Importantly, in the debt shift scenario, the whole productive sector is bypassed. The explanation of financial instability is not with reference to the productive sector, it's with reference to unproductive assets, predominantly real estate, but also other financial assets. And this is different from the work of people like Mian and Sufi, who've become very famous in mainstream economics for theorizing and modeling financial instability. They still do that through a productive framework, but I think we need to really look much more towards unproductive assets if you want to understand what's going on. Now, in the paper, I illustrate this by the long-term development of credit as a share of GDP on the vertical axis, which is stable, roughly stable, if you look at credit to non-financial business, so that's credit going to the productive sector, but which is rising if you look at other credit, which is predominantly residential and commercial mortgage credit, but also other bank loans to non-bank financial business. So this is where the rise in debt to incomes is, because credit to GDP is debt to incomes. And this is where the financial fragility builds up. So this is an empirical validation, if you like, or an indication of relevance for the debt shift hypothesis. And this is true not just for the US, but for many countries. Here you see on the vertical axis, the share of credit that's going to non-financial business, to the productive sectors, that's the blue dotted line. And it's going down in all countries as a share of total credit. And it's mirrored in a rise of credit to real estate and financial asset markets in many countries in my research. This has a negative effect on resilience. Here on the vertical axis, we see the length of recovery after the great financial crisis. And on the vertical axis, we see the percentage point change in mortgage credit share. So the more mortgage credit borrowing there was before the great financial crisis, the longer it took an average country to recover. So this undermines resilience, just as you would expect from the financial instability hypothesis. Okay, Jannes has been very strict in asking us to show some discipline. So here is my final slide. Let me sum up. Minsky's financial instability hypothesis assumed financing for investment in capital goods, and he always referred to productive capital goods there. In hedge finance, returns on investment return to the borrower to repay loans. This is the hedge stable situation. In speculative or even Ponzi financed, profit isn't enough to service financial obligation, and therefore financial fragility develops endogenously. In reality, today, this was not the case when Minsky developed the financial instability hypothesis in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s. Today, most investment is in existing assets, financial or real estate assets. The macroeconomic relevance is that this gives capital gains to the seller, but they don't give profit to the borrower. So the debt and the income to repay the debt do not land on the same balance sheet. And there is no income, but there is capital gain ultimately. That's a crucial difference. And you can only see it on the system level. Therefore, you get an aggregate rise in debt, but not in income, as I showed for the US. And default can only be postponed by borrowing more, which is Ponzi, the definition of Ponzi finance. Now, the consequences of this, and I show this at greater length in the paper, are not just instability. So this is not the financial instability hypothesis translated to current financial structures only, but from the debt shift hypothesis, it also follows, and you can show this analytically. First, there will be lower income growth, and that's simply because investment shifts away from productive investment and away from income generation. So when growth means income growth, you get lower income growth. And that explains why you can have a low growth economy, but booming financial markets. Second, you get lower resilience, as I showed. And third, you get more rent seeking, because the revenues will be taken increasingly as capital gains, not as income, and capital gains are rents. And this also implies more inequality, because rent seeking is almost by definition increasing inequality in incomes and in wealth. So my claim in this paper is that debt shift is today's predominant manifestation of the financial instability hypothesis. In the paper, I give references to a number of other papers that I've done in the last years, which develop this theme, different parts of this paper. So this is pulling together my research over the last few years in a conceptual framework and illustrating it empirically. That shift is Minsky for today, is my claim. And I think it helps to keep Minsky relevant for understanding the economy that we live in. Thank you very much.